The same people who cast her out returned on their knees, begging her for the one thing only she could provide. Cast out by the very people she tried to save, a crippled Eliza Thorne was left to freeze to death in the heart of a Montana blizzard. She was rescued by a giant cowboy on the brink of ruin, a man who saw her as just another burden. What he didn't know was that her hidden talent was the only key that could save his entire dying ranch. The wind had teeth, and it was biting through Eliza Thorne's worn coat. The snow didn't just fall, it descended with a fury, a premature blizzard that sought to bury the Montana Valley in a shroud of white. Each step was a battle, the crude wooden prosthetic on her right leg sinking into the deepening drifts, a dead weight that mocked her every effort to move forward. It was this leg, this constant aching reminder of the accident, that had sealed her fate. Behind her, the faint lights of Hope Valley had been swallowed by the storm. She didn't need to see them to feel their judgment. She could still hear Elder Bishop's voice, cold and final as a tombstone, echoing in the wind. "We took you in, Miss Thorne. We listened to your strange talk of crop rotation and soil nutrients. And for what? Dust. The land has forsaken us, and we cannot carry a burden through this winter." A burden. The word clung to her, colder than the ice forming on her eyelashes. They had watched from their windows as she limped past the town line, their silence a heavier condemnation than any shout. She had tried to save them, to use her knowledge to coax life from the tired, unforgiving soil, but the drought had been relentless, and when the rains finally came, they brought only flood and ruin. It was easier to blame the outsider with strange ideas than to blame God or the land itself. Despair was a cold, heavy stone in her gut. Her body, already pushed to its limit, began to betray her. The world narrowed to a swirling vortex of white, the howling wind a chorus of all her failures. She stumbled, the prosthetic catching on a hidden root beneath the snow. The impact sent a jarring shock through her body, and she fell, a small, dark shape against the vast, indifferent landscape. She tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled and refused to obey. This is it, she thought, a strange sense of calm washing over her. This is the end of the road. She closed her eyes, letting the snow begin its quiet work of covering her. Then, through the storm's roar, came a different sound, a heavy, rhythmic crunching, too powerful to be a wolf or a deer. Eliza forced her eyes open. A figure emerged from the whiteout, so immense it seemed less a man and more a moving piece of the mountain. He sat atop a jet-black horse that snorted clouds of steam into the frigid air. The man's shoulders were broad enough to block out what little light remained, his face shadowed by the brim of a snow-caked hat. He reined the horse to a halt just feet from her, looking down with an unreadable expression. He was a giant, carved from the very rock and ice that was trying to claim her. For a long moment, he simply watched her, a silent monolith in the heart of the tempest. Then, a low voice, rough like stones grinding together, cut through the wind. "You alive?" Eliza couldn't answer. She could only watch as he swung himself off the horse with an easy grace that defied his size. The last thing she felt before the world went black was the impossible strength of his arms lifting her from her snowy grave. Warmth was the first thing she registered. A deep, penetrating warmth that pushed the blizzard's icy memory from her bones. The scent of pine smoke, old leather, and the sharp tang of antiseptic filled her lungs. Eliza's eyes fluttered open to a ceiling of thick, dark wooden beams. She was lying in a narrow bed covered by a heavy wool blanket that felt coarse but clean against her skin. Her torn, wet clothes were gone, replaced by a simple flannel nightshirt that was far too large for her. Her prosthetic leg rested on a stool by the fire, drying near the hearth. Someone had tended to the stump, which was wrapped in a clean bandage. The room was Spartan, built for function, not comfort. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its low fire casting flickering shadows. A single window looked out onto a world of unrelenting white, a vast, empty expanse of snow that stretched toward a line of dark, jagged mountains in the distance. This wasn't a home. It was a fortress, a bulwark against the wildness outside. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant moan of the wind. The door creaked open, and an old man shuffled in, carrying a wooden tray. He was wiry and weathered, his face a road map of hard years, and his eyes, small and sharp, held an undisguised hostility. He set the tray down on the bedside table with a thud. It held a bowl of thin broth and a hunk of dark bread that looked hard as a rock. This had to be Gus. "Boss ain't one to see a stray freeze," the old man rasped, his voice like gravel. "But charity's a luxury this valley can't afford for long. Hay's short, and winter's just begun." His gaze flickered to her prosthetic leg, and then away, a silent dismissal. Eliza tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness washing over her. "Thank you," she managed, her own voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. Gus just grunted in response, turning to leave. The dismissal was as clear as a slammed door. She was an obligation, a piece of driftwood washed up on their shore. Later the giant himself appeared, filling the doorway. Caleb Blackwood seemed even larger indoors, his head nearly brushing the top of the frame. He moved with a quiet heaviness, his face set in grim lines that the firelight did little to soften. He didn't speak at first, simply crossing the room to check the bandage on her leg. His hands, though calloused and huge, were surprisingly gentle as he assessed the wrapping, his touch clinical and detached. "No fever," he stated, more to himself than to her. He met her gaze for the first time, and she saw nothing there but a deep, weary emptiness. "Eat. Rest," he commanded, his voice low and final. "We'll talk when you can stand." He turned and left as abruptly as he had entered, leaving the profound silence in his wake. Eliza looked from the meager meal to the endless snow outside the window. They had saved her life, but she understood with a chilling certainty that she was not welcome here. She had merely traded the open hostility of Hope Valley for a cold, silent prison, where the chill came not from the wind, but from the frozen hearts of the men inside. After 3 days, the storm broke, leaving behind a world of blinding sun and silent, sculpted snow. Strength had slowly returned to Eliza's limbs, and with it, a restless urge to escape the 4 walls of her room. Strapping on her prosthetic, she stepped out from the main house into the biting air. The Blackwood Ranch was even more immense than she'd imagined, a collection of barns and outbuildings huddled in the valley floor, all of them bearing the scars of time and neglect. It was a place built on a grand scale, but now it felt hollow, haunted by the ghost of a greater ambition. Her wandering took her to the far side of the main corral, to a structure nearly swallowed by a snowdrift. It was a greenhouse, its glass panes clouded with grime and cracked like spider webs. The wood frame, silvered with age, sagged under the weight of past winters. It looked like a place of forgotten dreams, a monument to a hope that had long since died. Gus had seen her looking at it earlier, his lip curling with disdain. "The boss sealed that place up after Mrs. Blackwood passed," he'd grumbled. "Nothing but ghosts and dead things in there now." His words, meant as a warning, felt like an invitation. Prying the warped door open, Eliza stepped inside. The air was still and cold, smelling of dry earth and decay. Brittle, lifeless vines clung to the walls, and broken pots littered the floor. But beneath the chaos, there was a sense of order. A long potting bench stood against one wall, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. In a dry corner, tucked beneath a rotted burlap sack, was a small cedar box. Its hinges creaked as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in dried moss, were dozens of small paper packets, each one sealed with wax and labeled in a delicate, precise hand. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers, trembling slightly, traced the elegant script: Alpine, fire pink, glacier lily. Winter fodder grass. These weren't common seeds purchased from a catalogue. They were carefully harvested heirlooms chosen by a knowing hand, each one a testament to a deep understanding of this unforgiving land. They were a legacy. This was the work of Cal's late wife, a silent conversation across the years between two women who had tried to make the wilderness bloom. Holding the packets felt like holding a handful of tiny, sleeping promises. Gus's warning echoed in her mind, but it was drowned out by a fierce, sudden resolve. This was something she could do. It wasn't charity, it wasn't a burden. It was work, it was life. Here, in this forgotten glass house, surrounded by the ghosts of another woman's hope, Eliza Thorne made a decision. She would not just survive in this cold, silent place. She would grow. The conversation in the main barn was clipped and grim, each word a puff of white in the frozen air. Caleb Blackwood drove a pitchfork into the last stack of hay with controlled violence. The bales, once piled high to the rafters, now formed a meager island in the vast, cold space. "It won't last another month," Cal stated, his voice flat. Gus, leaning against a post, chewed on a piece of straw, his eyes narrowed. "The north ridge is bare rock, the east pastures frozen solid. Nothing for the herd to graze on, till the thaw." For a week, the Blackwood riders had scoured every corner of their land, returning each evening with the same report: snow, ice, and rock. The drought of the past year had withered the summer grass, leaving nothing for the winter to preserve. Hope was a commodity in shorter supply than hay. That evening, Eliza approached Cal as he stood staring into the fire, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. She held a small canvas pouch in her hands. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "There is a place beyond the dry creek bed. The land looks barren, but the soil composition is different there. It's alkaline, but it retains moisture deep down." She paused, gathering her courage. "I believe I can grow something there, a type of winter fodder grass." The seeds were in the greenhouse. Gus, who had been cleaning a rifle in the corner, let out a short, derisive laugh. "Grow grass? In the middle of winter? On the worst patch of land on this entire ranch? What are you, some kind of earth witch?" Eliza met the old man's glare without flinching. "I am a botanist. I understand the soil. The grass is bred for these conditions. It grows low and fast. It wouldn't be much, but it might be enough to bridge the gap until spring." Cal turned from the fire, his face a mask of exhaustion. He looked from Eliza's earnest face to Gus's open skepticism. Every rational instinct, every hard lesson the land had taught him, told him it was impossible, but desperation was a powerful motivator. He had stared into the face of ruin for so long that a single, insane spark of hope felt more potent than a lifetime of bitter experience. He drained the whiskey in one long swallow, the glass making a sharp sound as he set it down. "How much seed do you have?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Eliza's shoulders, which had been tensed for refusal, relaxed slightly. "Enough for a few acres." Cal stared at her for a long moment, his gaze weighing the impossible against the inevitable. "Then you'll have your acres," he said, turning his back to them both. "Don't make me regret it." A week later, a rider appeared on the horizon, a lone, dark figure moving steadily against the vast white backdrop. It wasn't one of their own. Gus, sharpening an axe by the barn, stopped his work, his body going still. "Vultures flying," he muttered under his breath as Cal emerged from the house, his expression hardening as he recognized the visitor. Silas Croft dismounted with a flourish, his expensive leather chaps and silver-trimmed saddle, a stark contrast to the hard-scrabble reality of the Blackwood Ranch. He was a man of middling height, but he carried himself with an arrogant swagger, a predatory smile fixed on his face. "Caleb," he called out, his voice smooth and confident. "Tough winter. I heard you're burning through your hay faster than a brush fire." "What do you want, Silas?" Cal's tone was flat, devoid of any welcome. Silas chuckled, taking a slow look around at the weathered barn and silent house. "I'm a neighbor, just offering a neighborly hand. This land, it's got a mean streak. It broke your father, and it's breaking you. I'm prepared to make you a fair offer, enough to let you walk away with your dignity before you've got nothing left to sell but your bones." The offer hung in the air, an insult disguised as a kindness. Just then, Eliza appeared in the doorway of the house, drawn by the voices. Silas's eyes slid over to her, a flicker of cruel amusement in them. He took in her patched coat and the unmistakable shape of the prosthetic beneath her trousers. "Well, well," he purred, his smile widening. "I see you've taken in strays, a crippled one at that. Some folks might call that a bad omen, Caleb, inviting bad luck right through your front door." A muscle jumped in Cal's jaw. His stillness was more menacing than any shout. Eliza felt a flush of shame, but it was quickly replaced by a cold anger. She met Silas's gaze, her chin held high. "The only bad luck I see here," Cal said, his voice a low growl, "is you, standing on my property. The answer's no." Silas held up his hands in mock surrender. "Suit yourself, but pride doesn't fill a hungry belly. Sooner or later this valley gets rid of its burdens." He shot one last venomous look at Eliza before swinging onto his horse. He galloped away, leaving a profound and threatening silence in his wake. The word hung in the air between Cal and Eliza, unspoken but understood. Burdens. The world was full of men eager to name them. The weeks that followed Silas Croft's visit were heavy with a grim, unspoken tension. The hay dwindled, and the mood of the ranch grew darker with each passing day. For Eliza, the dilapidated greenhouse became her only refuge, a small world of quiet, focused work where the ghosts of the past felt more like allies than specters. She patched the broken panes with scraped hide, reinforced the sagging frame, and tended to the fragile seedlings with a devotion that bordered on prayer. It was a silent act of rebellion against the encroaching despair. One morning, she walked from the greenhouse to the main house, her steps sure-footed on the packed snow. In her arms, she carried a wicker basket. It wasn't heavy, but its contents were more precious than gold. Inside, nestled on a clean cloth, was a small harvest of deep green spinach, crisp kale, and a handful of shockingly red radishes, all glowing like jewels against the winter landscape. They were the first fruits of her labor, a vibrant, living defiance of the frozen world. She found Gus in the kitchen, methodically slicing salted pork into thin, depressing strips for the evening meal. He didn't look up until she placed the basket on the rough-hewn wooden table. He stopped, the knife still in his hand, and simply stared. The sound of the wind outside seemed to fade away. He slowly reached out and picked up a single spinach leaf, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger as if to confirm it was real. He looked from the impossible greenery to Eliza's face, his own a mask of disbelief. The scorn was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, speechless awe. At that moment, Cal entered the kitchen, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He stopped short, his gaze following Gus's to the basket. He stood frozen for a long second, his weary expression shifting to one of utter astonishment. He looked at the vibrant vegetables, then at Eliza, and for the first time his eyes held something other than pity or duty. It was wonder, a flicker of light in the vast, empty rooms of his gaze. "How?" he asked, the single word hanging in the air, thick with meaning. Eliza simply nodded toward the window, in the direction of the little glass house. That night, for the first time in months, the men of the Blackwood Ranch ate fresh food. The silence around the dinner table was different. It was no longer the heavy silence of despair, but a quiet, thoughtful reverence. No one spoke of the miracle, but they all felt it. Eliza Thorne, The crippled burden, the stray taken in from the storm, had made the dead earth bear fruit in the heart of winter. She was not a witch, they were beginning to realize. She was a promise. The small victory of the greenhouse was short-lived. Hope, Eliza learned, was a fragile crop in this valley. The new crisis began not with a roar, but with a quiet, ominous trickle. The main creek, the artery that fed the entire ranch, was shrinking. Each morning, its stony banks were more exposed, the current slower and shallower. Cal and his men watched with grim acceptance, their faces etched with the familiar anxiety of men who lived at the mercy of the sky. "The drought," Gus said, his voice heavy. "It's finally digging its teeth into the bedrock. The creek's dying." Then the cattle began to fall ill. It started with a single calf, found trembling and weak by the water's edge. Soon, others followed, their heads hanging low, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They were thirsty, yet the very water meant to save them seemed to be poisoning them. The men worked tirelessly, hauling the sick animals to a separate corral, their movements tight with a growing sense of panic. And this was a threat far greater than a shortage of hay. It was an attack on the very future of the Blackwood Ranch. While Cal and his hands focused on the herd, Eliza made her way to the dying creek. The men saw a lack of water. She saw an ecosystem in distress. She knelt at the water's edge, ignoring the cold that seeped through her trousers. She let the silty water run through her fingers, then picked up a handful of the damp, dark earth from the bank. The other men had stood here and seen only mud. Eliza lifted it to her nose and inhaled deeply. Beneath the natural scent of wet stone and cold soil, there was something else. A faint, acrid odor, sharp and unnatural. It was a chemical whisper, a scent that had no place in the clean, harsh purity of the Montana wilderness. She crumbled the soil between her fingers, her brow furrowed in concentration. She saw the sickly, iridescent film clinging to the rocks just below the waterline. This wasn't the work of nature. A drought could starve a creek, but it could not poison it. A cold dread settled in her stomach, heavier than any she had felt during the blizzard. The land wasn't just dying from neglect or a cruel season. It was being murdered. Eliza found Gus in the tack room, his gnarled hands methodically mending a broken leather strap. The air was thick with the scent of saddle soap and old horsehide. She hesitated in the doorway, the cold dread from the creek still clinging to her. He looked up, his expression no longer hostile, but wary and watchful. "Something's troubling you," he stated, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. "The creek," Eliza said, stepping into the dim light. "Gus, the soil. It's not right. There's a scent, like sulfur or lye. It's faint, but it's there. Nature doesn't make that smell." Gus stopped his work. He set the leather strap down with deliberate care and stared at her, his sharp eyes searching her face. He was silent for a long moment, the cogs of a long and weary life turning behind his eyes. He thought of the sick cattle, the dying creek, and the memory of Silas Croft's slick, predatory smile. A lifetime of ranching intuition connected with the single hard fact Eliza had just given him. A grim understanding settled on his face. He glanced over his shoulder toward the open barn door, then grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly firm. "Not here," he whispered, pulling her deeper into the shadows of the tack room. "You listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "About 5 years back, the Miller family had the spread just south of here. Good people. Hard workers. Then their well went sour overnight. Said it tasted of metal. Their fences got cut, spooked a dozen head of cattle into a ravine. Everyone called it a string of bad luck. They were broke inside of a year." Silas Croft bought their land for pennies on the dollar. He let the story hang in the air, its meaning as sharp as a knife. "That man is a snake in the grass," Gus continued, his eyes boring into hers. "He don't just wait for a thing to die, girl. He helps it along. He saw you. He knows you ain't just another mouth to feed." He looked at her then, not as a burden, but as a weapon he hadn't known they possessed. That brain of yours. You see things the rest of us are too plain to notice. In this valley, that makes you dangerous. It makes you a threat to a man like him. He released her arm, but his gaze held her fast. You be careful, you hear me? From now on, you watch your back. In that moment, the old cantankerous ranch hand became her staunchest ally, a silent guardian against a poison that was far more deadly than anything seeping into the water. The ranch was now on a strict water ration. Every bucket was measured, every drop precious. The lowing of the thirsty cattle was a constant, mournful sound that frayed the nerves of every hand. Cal had grown more withdrawn, a silent giant haunted by the slow, inexorable death of his land. He'd spend hours on the porch, staring at the brown, withered pastures, the weight of his father's failure and his own impending ruin pressing down on him. One evening, as he stood his grim vigil, Eliza approached him quietly. She didn't offer empty platitudes or easy solutions. She simply stood beside him, her presence a silent testament to a shared resolve. He finally turned to her, the conflict in his eyes raw and deep. "She used to do that," he said, his voice raspy with disuse. "Lily, my wife, she'd stand right here and just watch the land. Said it spoke to her, if you knew how to listen." He looked at Eliza, a flicker of a long-buried vulnerability in his gaze. "You listen the same way she did." He led her not to the main living area, but down a short hall to a door that was coated in a thin layer of dust. The room inside was a place frozen in time. A woman's study. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, their faint scent still clinging to the air. Books on botany and geology lined a small shelf, and a rocking chair sat empty by the window. It was here, in this preserved sanctuary, that he opened a heavy cedar chest and carefully lifted out a stack of leather-bound journals. "She was always writing," he said softly, handing them to Eliza. "Always drawing, always searching for a way to make this place gentler." Eliza sat at the small desk, the journals open before her like a sacred text. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting and beautiful, precise drawings of local flora. It was the work of a keen and hopeful mind. Tucked inside the final journal, she found it, a map, hand-drawn on a piece of tanned sheepskin. It was a detailed rendering of the Blackwood Valley, but it was annotated not with property lines, but with notes on soil types and plant life. In the rugged, undeveloped western quarter of the ranch, a small area was circled in faded ink. Beside it, a simple three-word phrase was written in Lily's delicate script, "Where the willows weep." Eliza traced the words with her finger. "What does it mean?" Cal looked over her shoulder, his eyes fixed on his late wife's handwriting. "I don't know," he admitted, "but she was always drawn to that old grove. Said the willows there were the oldest things in the valley. Said they held secrets." For the first time in a long time, a sliver of light cut through the despair in his eyes. It wasn't a promise, but it was a clue, a whisper of hope from a woman who had never stopped listening to the land. Dawn broke cold and clear, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pale rose. There was a new, grim purpose in the air at the Blackwood Ranch. Armed with Lily's map and a shared, unspoken resolve, Cal and Eliza rode out towards the western quarter, a remote and rugged part of the valley bordering Silas Croft's land. Lily's map led them not to the main creek, but to a smaller, winding tributary hidden amongst a maze of rocky outcrops and skeletal cottonwoods. The notes say, "This tributary feeds the main water table," Eliza explained, her voice quiet against the vast silence. "If Silas was going to poison the creek, he'd do it here, upstream, where it's less likely to be found." They dismounted and followed the tributary on foot. After an hour of searching, they found it. A faint trail, almost invisible to an untrained eye, led down from the ridge that marked the edge of Silas's property. And there, tucked behind a screen of withered brush near the water's edge, they saw the evidence. A whitish powder, the same substance that had left its chemical scent in the mud downstream, was spilled on the dark, damp rocks. A discarded burlap sack, identical to the one Eliza had found remnants of, lay half hidden under a bush. It was the source of the poison, the heart of the treachery. As Cal knelt to examine the powder, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Silas Croft and one of his grim-faced ranch hands appeared on the ridge above them. Silas reined in his horse, his initial surprise quickly hardening into a look of cold fury. "You're a long way from home, Caleb," Silas called down, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "Trespassing, looks like." "This is my land, Silas, and you know it," Cal said, rising to his full, intimidating height. His voice was a low growl of contained rage. He gestured to the tainted rocks. "And this is your poison." Silas let out a cold laugh. "I see some spilled minerals on a rock." "You're seeing ghosts because your ranch is turning into one. You're a desperate man, seeing conspiracies in the dust." He looked past Cal to Eliza, his eyes filled with venom. "You and that little earth witch of yours should get back to your own side of the valley before you get hurt. The rocks can be treacherous out here." The threat was unmistakable, a promise delivered with a smile. He and his man turned their horses and disappeared over the ridge, leaving an echoing silence behind them. They had the proof, but the confrontation had changed everything. This was no longer a secret war. It was a declaration. There was no time left. The poisoned creek was a death sentence, and the ranch's reserve barrels were nearly empty. The confrontation with Silas had been a declaration of war, but it was a war they would lose in a matter of days without water. All their hope now rested on 3 faded words on a dead woman's map. Led by Eliza, Cal and Gus rode towards the grove of willows. The journey was arduous, taking them through rocky canyons and up steep, treacherous slopes. They moved with a grim, focused intensity, a team forged by desperation. When they finally arrived, the place felt sacred and ancient. A cluster of massive weeping willows, their branches hanging like a green curtain, stood in a shallow basin, an island of impossible life in the parched landscape. "The air is cooler here," Eliza said, her voice hushed as she dismounted. "The ground is different." She walked the grove slowly, her hand trailing against the rough bark of the trees, her eyes scanning the ground. She wasn't looking for a sign. She was reading a language only she understood. She crumbled the dark, rich soil, noting its texture. She pointed to a cluster of broad-leafed ferns growing in a slight depression. "Here," she said with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "This specific fern only grows where its roots can touch a constant, deep water source. We dig here." The work was brutal. Cal, his face set like granite, drove the shovel into the earth with a strength that seemed superhuman. Gus worked beside him with the steady, relentless pace of an old man who knew how to conserve his energy. Hours passed. The sun beat down, and the hole grew deeper, but the earth remained stubbornly dry. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to creep into the air. Gus paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Maybe," he began, his voice hoarse. "Maybe you were wrong." "No," Eliza said, her voice fierce. "She wasn't wrong." Cal, his jaw tight, raised the heavy pickaxe high over his head and brought it down with a mighty grunt. It struck the bottom of the hole, not with the dull thud of dry earth or the sharp crack of rock, but with a deep, wet, sucking sound. He struck again. A trickle of dark mud bubbled up. He threw the pickaxe aside, dropped to his knees, and began digging with his bare hands. A moment later, a pool of clean, clear water began to seep into the hole. It grew from a puddle to a pool, the sound of it gurgling to life, the sweetest music they had ever heard. Gus let out a choked laugh, sinking to his knees beside the hole. Cal remained perfectly still, his massive shoulders shaking as silent tears carved paths through the grime on his face. Eliza knelt and dipped her hand into the cool, clean water, a profound sense of peace settling over her. They had found it. It was more than water. It was salvation. Their elation was a fragile thing, quickly extinguished by the shifting mood of the mountains. As they made their way back from the willow grove, the sky, once a brilliant blue, turned a bruised, menacing gray. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons with a sudden, violent fury. A blizzard, fiercer and more sudden than the one that had brought Eliza to his door, descended upon them, erasing the world in a blinding sheet of white. They were forced to take refuge in a tiny line shack, a one-room trapper's cabin tucked into the side of a rock face, a place Cal hadn't used in years. Inside, the world shrank to the size of the small, dark room. The storm raged outside, a wild beast throwing itself against their flimsy shelter. A small pot-bellied stove provided a meager circle of warmth and flickering light. The forced intimacy was absolute, leaving no room for the silence and distance they had maintained for so long. The emotional high of finding the spring, followed by the terror of the storm, had stripped away the last of Cal's defenses. He stared into the stove's small, grated window, the flames reflecting in his haunted eyes. "This is how it happened," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "The storm. It came out of nowhere, just like this one." Eliza waited, knowing this was a dam of grief that had been waiting to break for years. "Lily and our little girl, Sarah. They were here. I'd gone to town for supplies. Should have only been a day. The blizzard hit, and I was stranded. It took me 3 days to get back." He choked on the words, his massive shoulders trembling. "When I finally made it home, the house was cold, so cold, the fire had gone out. They were huddled in their bed. They just went to sleep." He finally looked at her, his face a mask of anguish. "I wasn't here. A man is supposed to protect his family. He's supposed to keep them warm and safe. I failed. I failed them, Eliza." She moved from her spot on the floor and sat beside him on the rough wooden bench. She didn't offer pity. She offered the only thing she had, the truth of her own pain. "The people of Hope Valley blamed me for their failed crops. They blamed me for my leg. For a long time, I believed them. I thought if I had just been smarter, stronger, better, I could have changed things." She looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. "But a drought is a drought, Cal, and a storm is a storm. They don't care about our plans or our love or our guilt. They just are. It wasn't your fault." His ragged breathing was the only sound besides the wind. He slowly reached out and took her hand, his large, calloused fingers engulfing hers. In the heart of the raging blizzard, surrounded by ghosts of the past, they found a quiet, shared shelter not of wood and stone, but of 2 broken hearts finally beginning to heal. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world transformed, hushed and heavy under a thick blanket of new snow. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, a new, unspoken understanding flowing between Cal and Eliza, more profound than any words. Gus met them at the barn, his weathered face cracking into a rare, relieved smile, a silent prayer of thanks in his eyes. 2 days later, the sheriff rode in from town, his horse kicking up clouds of fresh powder. He brought news that traveled through the valley like a shockwave. "Silas Croft is ruined," the sheriff said, accepting a cup of hot coffee from Gus. "The storm caught him completely unprepared. Sold off most of his winter hay, it seems. Lost more than half his herd to the cold." He took a sip, his eyes grim. "That ain't the half of it. We caught him red-handed trying to dynamite the old beaver dam on the North Fork. When we brought him in, he confessed to everything, Caleb. The poison in your creek, the whole damn scheme. He knew about the spring on your land, wanted to bleed you dry so he could buy it for nothing." The villain of their story had not been felled by a hero, but by the weight of his own avarice. As the sheriff was preparing to leave, another set of riders appeared. Eliza recognized them instantly. It was a small delegation from Hope Valley, led by Elder Bishop himself. They stopped their horses at the entrance to the yard, their faces a mixture of desperation and deep, humbling shame. They looked thin, and their clothes were frayed. Cal stood beside Eliza on the porch, his presence a silent, solid wall, but he remained quiet, knowing this was her moment. Elder Bishop dismounted, his movements slow and tired. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands as he approached the porch. He did not look at Cal. He looked directly at Eliza. "Miss Thorne," he began, his voice hoarse, the arrogance stripped from it completely. "The storm. It took what little we had left. Our barns collapsed. Our reserves are gone." He finally looked up, and in his eyes Eliza saw not the stern judge, but a broken, desperate man. We heard you found water. We've come to ask if you would sell some to us. We have nowhere else to turn." The entire ranch seemed to hold its breath. Here they were, the people who had called her a burden, who had left her to die in the snow, now begging for the salvation she had discovered. A bitter satisfaction flickered within her, but was quickly replaced by something else, something forged in the cold silence of the line shack. She looked at their desperate faces, and she did not see her enemies. She saw neighbors. "We don't sell water to neighbors, Elder," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent yard. "We share it." A collective sigh of disbelief went through the delegation. "But," she added, her tone becoming firm, "this is a working ranch. You will pay for the barrels, and you will provide the labor to transport it. We offer a hand up, not a handout." Elder Bishop simply nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears, unable to speak. The power in the valley had shifted, not with a clash of arms, but with a quiet act of grace. Spring came to the valley, not as a gentle guest, but as a powerful, life-affirming flood. The snow receded, and the land, fed by the secret spring and the melting drifts, awoke with a vibrant, impossible green. The sound of the revived creek was a constant happy murmur, and the meadows were dotted with healthy, newborn calves. The Blackwood Ranch was no longer a fortress against the world. It was the thriving, beating heart of the valley. Eliza stood on the porch, a place where she had once felt like a prisoner. Now she was its mistress. A legal document, locked safely in Cal's desk, bore both their names. She rested a hand on the porch rail, her new prosthetic leg, a marvel of polished hardwood and fitted leather, crafted by a master artisan in town as a gift from the ranch hands. It was strong and sure, and she walked with a confidence that came not from forgetting her wound, but from fully embracing the strength it had given her. She watched as a wagon from Hope Valley rumbled past on the main road, loaded with supplies for their own spring planting. They were using the methods and the hardy seeds she had shared, their fields now showing the first signs of green. Elder Bishop now sought her counsel, not as a burden, but as a respected peer. The bitterness between the two communities had been washed away, replaced by a partnership born of shared hardship and mutual respect. Cal came to stand beside her, his presence as solid and comforting as the mountains themselves. He slid an arm around her shoulders, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the land they had saved together. The ghosts of the past were finally at peace, their legacy not of sorrow, but of the quiet, resilient life now blooming all around them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He opened his palm, and resting in the center was a single perfect seed, its shell as dark and smooth as polished river stone. "It's from one of Lily's heirloom plants," he said, his voice soft. "A night-blooming flower. She always said it was a symbol of hope in the darkness." He gently took her hand and curled her fingers around the seed, his large hand enveloping hers. "Lily tried to plant a future here," he said, his gaze meeting hers, full of a love that was as deep and steady as the spring itself. "You, Eliza, are the one who made it grow." He looked out at the thriving valley, then back at her, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. "And this one," he said, pressing her hand gently, "this one is for the future we build together." Eliza closed her hand around the tiny, powerful promise, feeling the warmth of the spring sun on her face. Finally and truly home. In the end, Eliza held the fate of her former community in her hands. She chose grace over revenge. But was it the right choice? I want to know what you would have done. Comment 1 if you agree with her forgiveness, or 0 if they deserve to be left on their own. If you believe in the power of a story to move the human heart, subscribe to our channel. We share a new journey like this every single day.